welcome to the Dartmouth Historical and Art Society Sunday afternoon lecture series. I'm Bob Harding, and I'm very happy to see all of you here this afternoon. This was originally scheduled for last Sunday, as you know, and the snow caused us to postpone. Last year, we had the privilege of postponing one of our speakers 3 times. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And I'm scheduled for the 21st this year, which is a sure sign.
Dartmouth antecedents. Anyway, I'm very happy to have you here. And please, if you're not a member, consider being a member of our organization. Enid, and she'll sign you up later on if you're interested after we finish the program. The speaker this evening, who is one of many distinguished speakers we have scheduled this year, is Mr. Bob Maker. Bob is a specialist and a deep researcher into the work of a guy named Henry Barnard Worth, who was one of the more prolific local historians in writing and speaking, and also collecting information and records that are very reliable and very useful for those of us who are interested in local history and genealogy. And Bob is the only person I know who knows more than anyone I know about the work of Henry Worth, the published work and the unpublished work. And I've heard Bob speak before, and he also knows very much about Russell's Mills and its origins, and many other good things that I think many of you will find very interesting. So I'm not going to take any more of Bob's time. I'll introduce Mr. Bob Maker.
Well, we'll start with Henry Worth. Henry Worth was from an old Nantucket family, and his father and his grandfather, and I don't know how many generations before him, were from Nantucket. And he was related to all the other old Nantucket families, the Folgers and the Gardners. And so Henry was born in 1858 and went to Amherst College, then studied for the bar, and when he passed the bar, he moved to New Bedford and became a lawyer. A lawyer specializing in real estate law. And specializing in real estate meant that he spent a lot of time looking at old deeds and wills. Property changes hands mostly in one of 2 ways. Either guy A sells it to guy B, in which case there's a deed, or else guy A dies and leaves it to guy B, in which case there's a will and the probate records. And Henry Worth researched all these kinds of things going way back to the 1600s. And of course, we're so fortunate to have records that go back that far. And when the Old Dartmouth Historical Society got started in 1903, Henry Worth was a member right from the beginning and was very active in the society, and eventually became an officer. He held a number of different offices during his time associated with the Old Dartmouth. And so, in the early days of the Old Dartmouth Historical Society, they would have their meetings of a group of people interested in local history, and one of their members would usually give a talk. These meetings were usually quarterly, and after the talk it would get printed up and published as one of the Old Dartmouth historical sketches. and you may have seen some of these from time to time. Henry Worth wrote more of those sketches than any other one person. There were a bunch of people who wrote one or maybe two. Henry Worth wrote over 20 Old Dartmouth sketches, starting in right away in 1903 when the organization was founded. And he is best known for what is called the Palmer and Worth collection, where he teamed up with a photographer named Fred Palmer to document some of the oldest houses scattered throughout Old Dartmouth. And the way this came about was that we're told that during King Philip's War, all of the houses in Old Dartmouth were destroyed. The only thing that was left was part of the Russell garrison in Padenarram. But after the war was over, people realized almost immediately that the Native Americans were no longer a serious threat. And there was a wave of building and rebuilding that took place in the first years after the King Philip's War. And flash forward to 1903, and Henry Worth realizes that those first buildings built just after King Philip's War, that the only ones that were left in his day were rotting away and were going to be gone before anyone knew it. And he decided that it would be a good idea to document them. And so the first Old Dartmouth sketch was a talk that he gave called 10 Ancient Homes. And there were no photographs or drawings. There's no mention of Fred Palmer, who he collaborated with later. There's no indication that he intended to expand this original collection of 10 homes, but it clearly is the nucleus of what came later. And the 10 ancient homes that he chose to feature included ones that many of us know about. The William Ricketson House, which is more or less where the Buzzards Bay Brewery is now. The Waite Potter House in Westport, where the chimney is still standing. The Thomas Tabor House in Fairhaven, another what they call a Rhode Island stone ender, where the chimney is all that's left, but it is still standing in central Fairhaven. And so when he wrote up this sketch about these 10 ancient buildings, as I say, he didn't say anything about expanding this topic, but he did. And so the next version, I'm going to talk about multiple versions of the Palmer and Worth collection. And the next version was serialized in the newspaper, in the Mercury. And for this, now Henry Worth found himself a photographer. And his name was Fred Palmer. Fred Palmer ran a watch repair shop in the middle of New Bedford, where the Green Bean is right now. He was also a bicycle enthusiast and salesman, and a fine photographer. And so they began a collaboration, publishing a new house once a week, every week in the Mercury, on a Saturday, and it ran for about a year and a half. Every week there'd be an article about some older building within the limits of Old Dartmouth. And he chose that for that geographic range for his limits. Just about everything was within the 5 towns, Westport, Dartmouth, New Bedford, Fairhaven, and Acushnet, that made up the original town of Old Dartmouth. And these sketches about these houses were very popular. And so when the series finally finished its run, there were a couple of members of the Old Dartmouth Historical Society who said, these should be put together into a book. And so Herbert and Anna Cushman hired a typist to retype all of what had been in these newspaper articles, plus prints of the photographs, and they had it bound into a nice leather book, which is in the collection of the Old Dartmouth Historical Society today. It was never published. It was just the one single copy. And as it turns out, there were even more versions to come. There is a slightly different version that's owned by the New Bedford Free Public Library that has some additional photographs by Gilbert Kingman. And also, and this is what a lot of even serious New Bedford historians may not realize, that there is a Nantucket Palmer and Worth collection as well. And that he did the same kind of thing, researching the history of houses, combining with photographs by Fred Palmer, and those are now on the website of the Nantucket Historical Association. And unfortunately, they have only prints of their photographs, whereas the New Bedford collection, there are a lot of Fred Palmer's original glass negatives that still have survived, and they are of excellent quality. And unfortunately, the Nantucket collection does not have that same kind of detail, but it's still very, very valuable. And if you're surfing the internet, that's something that you might like to take a look at sometime, the Nantucket collection. So I said that he wrote over 20 of the Old Dartmouth sketches. I have just a few titles here to give you a sense of some of the things that he did. As I said, the first one was 10 Ancient Homes in 1903. He did a sketch on Smith Mills, one called The Head of Westport and Its Founders, the homesteads at Apponeganset before 1710, Hicks Bridge and the Handy House, the first settlers of Dartmouth and where they located, Oxford Village, Captain Thomas Tabor, the voyages of the ship Bartholomew Gosnold. One of the things that I really like about Henry Worth is he doesn't care very much about whaling. And he says very little about it. And too many people have this idea, New Bedford history is whaling, period. And Henry Worth is the antidote to that. But in this one case, he did write one sketch about a particular whaling ship, the Bartholomew Gosnold. And then the last one that he ever wrote, in 1921, Highways, Post Roads, and Public Houses of New Bedford before the arrival of the railroad train. And it turns out, this is quite a valuable piece of work. It has to do with liquor licenses. And in the 1700s and into the 1800s, if you wanted to have a liquor license, first of all, that wasn't a disreputable thing at all. And in fact, it was the men of means in the towns who ran establishments that served liquor. So if you wanted a liquor license, you had to apply for it. And Henry Worth tells us that nobody who applied was ever turned down. He tells us that nobody ever had their license taken away from them. But if you wanted one, you had to apply the first time, and those records still existed. And he went and found them and was able to reconstruct where were all these taverns at crossroads, and who was the people who originally ran them. It's great stuff. It's telling us a whole nother side of local history. That was Henry Worth's last Old Dartmouth sketch, because he died in 1923. And he did more than just work for the Old Dartmouth Historical Society. He did a lot of lecturing on his own, and he went all over the place, and he lectured on all kinds of topics. He lectured to groups in Taunton, Bridgewater, Lynn, Mattapoisett, Nantucket, New Bedford, Fall River. He lectured to vocational schools, family reunions, and the DAR. And there is one of his unpublished manuscripts was a lecture that he gave to the New Bedford DAR titled "The Difference Between Pilgrims and Puritans." And boy, that was helpful to me, because I was pretty foggy on what that was. And bless Henry, he explained it all. And I won't go into that all now. If anyone wants to ask questions later, that's fine. Henry Worth was a Mason, and he wrote his home lodge. Even though he lived in New Bedford, he maintained his membership in his home lodge on Nantucket throughout his life. But he wrote histories of two lodges in this area, the Star of the East Lodge and the Adoniram, I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, lodge. And those exist. But then there's a whole series of unpublished manuscripts by Henry Worth. And in fact, there are two collections of unpublished manuscripts at the Whaley Museum that contain many more essays that have never been published, and I've been gradually transcribing these, and eventually they are going to show up on the Whaley Museum's website and be accessible. But there's a whole bunch that just haven't been seen before. So here are some titles from that group. Bridges of Old Dartmouth. One of his published sketches was on the mills of Old Dartmouth before the introduction of steam power. And this Bridges essay is a great complement to the Mills essay. And often when someone built a mill, they dammed a pond, and the top of the dam became a road to connect one place to another. And Henry Worth spells that all out. And again, not just New Bedford, but throughout all of Old Dartmouth. That's a great one. He has an unpublished manuscript on Dartmouth in the Revolutionary War. There's a very limited number of sources about the British raid on Dartmouth in 1778. And they all say pretty much the same thing about the British landing at Clark's Cove and marching up County Street and then down Union and burning all these. Henry Worth tells us why. And he gets into the whole situation where the British Army was having a great deal of trouble supplying their troops, especially with food, especially with meat. They were too far away from England or land that they controlled in Canada or down in the Caribbean for any of those to be practical. And so they were hiring private individuals to bring in meat and other supplies for their troops. And that's who the privateers that were operating out of New Bedford Harbor were that's who they were targeting. They were targeting these private vessels that were supplying the British Army. And finally, the British were so hampered by this that they conducted this punitive raid on these privateers who were using New Bedford Harbor, but they weren't from New Bedford. They were from elsewhere. It was just a convenient place. And the Quakers owned warehouses in New Bedford, and they said, oh, we're Quakers. We're not going to get involved in this war stuff. But if you'd like to rent some warehouse space to store your stolen goods until you can sell them, well, that's just fine. That's business. We can do that. So anyway, that's a great essay that really explains a lot more about what was going on. He gave a lecture. Oh, I said that. Here's an unpublished manuscript on the North Rochester Parish, and another one on the original farms between Fort Phoenix and the head of Westport. So how did he find all his information? Well, like I said before, as a real estate lawyer, he dealt with deeds and wills all the time. And it's easy to think at first that's, as I said, that his historic research was a byproduct of his day job. But he goes into so much else, and so as I did more and more research, I started keeping track of what were some of his sources of information. He cites town meeting records, maps, Crane's surveys, Benjamin Crane's surveys of Old Dartmouth, Quaker records, diaries, state records and tax records. And he didn't just stay in New Bedford to do his research. There's evidence that he went to Boston and spent significant time poring through state records there. Newspaper articles and ads from early newspapers long before his day. Court records, business records, census records, And of course, he cites the most venerable source of all, tradition. So there have been a number of people who have been fans of Henry Worth and his work. And I wanted to give you just a few different assessments of Henry Worth and what he did. This first one is from an old Dartmouth sketch by William Wing. And he says, "A great service has been done the Society by Henry B. Worth, who has been indefatigable in seeking out the histories of the ancient homes in Old Dartmouth, which have been attractively photographed by Fred Palmer." In 1931, this is several years after Worth died, Thomas Tripp wrote an old Dartmouth sketch about the Uponnagansett meeting houses. And he says, "Lacking the unfailing memory and painstaking ability for research of a former member of this society, Mr. Henry B. Worth, I am somewhat handicapped in my efforts to present this afternoon an interesting array of facts and to recount in his charming way some of the fascinating episodes connected with the church life of the early worshipers here and their establishment of this meeting house and its predecessor and the meetings held therein." I've been talking about what Henry Worth did in the New Bedford, Old Dartmouth area, but he continued to maintain ties with Nantucket and did a lot of historical research there. So Alexander Starbuck, who was president of the Nantucket Historical Association, says, "To our historical association, Mr. Worth gave much of his time and effort. No miner for gold felt keener delight in upturning a sizable nugget than he felt in upturning an important or interesting historical fact. Probably no man living is so thoroughly conversant with the locations and divisions of old Nantucket estates as he." And then I'll give you just one more that's more recent. Henry Worth was an attorney by profession, but an after-hours, weekend, and vacation historian by choice. Associated with the Old Dartmouth Historical Society from its founding in 1903 until his death, he served as secretary of the society during the final decade of his life. No one did more to illuminate the past of Old Dartmouth, meaning the present town by that name prior to 1787. Known for his breadth of interest, research into primary documents, ability to synthesize a whole from scattered parts, and mastery of narrative, he set the standard by which all historians of the whaling city are compared. And that's by Robert Ricketson Murphy from his New Bedford Historical Sketch. So I wanted to not just talk about Henry Worth, but give him a little bit of a chance to speak for himself. And I looked through a lot of material that I had to find something that gave a flavor of his research and writing. And so I have a little selection here from his essay on Russell's Mills. I decided that that was appropriate for the evening. So I'm just going to read this. In relation to Russell's Mills, there is in print and widely circulated the following statement, quote, "In 1652, Ralph Russell set up an iron forge at Russell's Mills, which place received its name from him and was the first settlement of Dartmouth, and in 1858 the old forge is still to be seen. Apparently, this statement has for its basis one in the History of Plymouth Colony by Francis Bayleys, that, quote, Ralph Russell removed from Taunton to Dartmouth and was the progenitor of a numerous and respectable posterity. He, Bayleys, cited no authority and none is known. The paragraph above contains three assertions. One, that Russell established an iron forge at Russell's Mills. Two, that the place was named for him. And three, that this was the first portion of Dartmouth to be settled. Although not so stated, yet it is strongly implied that he settled in this locality and presumably that his residence was at Russell's Mills. There was no man named Russell among the first purchasers of Dartmouth, and Ralph Russell's name does not appear in any known record in New England as a landowner. So if he settled at Russell's Mills, the land did not belong to him. So far as the name of the village is concerned, it is of comparatively modern coinage. The first use of the name Russell's Mills as the designation of the village, in distinction from the mill itself, was shortly before 1800. The first use of the name Russell's Mills to designate a locality is in 1770 in the town layout of the road into Allen's Neck. Before that date, there was no village to be named, and the mill was always designated by the name of the owner. The first being Joseph Russell, 1702 to 1739, the next Benjamin Russell, and then Henry Smith, and then Cummings. The name Russell's Mills was applied to the village during the period when Henry Smith owned the mill. While it is not possible to state from whom it was named, yet the inference is strong that it was from either Joseph or Benjamin Russell. It should be clearly understood that the mill owned by Joseph and Benjamin Russell was the grist mill at the place where the Potomska Road crosses the river. As to the Russell's Mills being the first spot in Dartmouth to be settled, the writer of the paragraph quoted means a permanent settlement. It is not easy to prove a negative, yet all indications that exist as records point to the conclusion that the first homesteads were located on the east side of the Acushnet River. At this point, an entirely fair inquiry would be to ask, why should Ralph Russell locate at Russell's Mills where he did not own any land? There were no natural resources there except second-rate water power, and this was in a wilderness among Indians and several miles from the bay. In 1652, iron workers were not seeking water power, but iron deposits, and their mills were located at the point most convenient in both respects. Mere water power, better in strength and volume, could have been found in scores of places where strong overshot wheels could have been operated, in comparison with which Russell's Mills was third or fourth rate power. The nearest iron deposit was in the northeastern corner of the town, and there were two iron works in that vicinity where there was water power superior to that of Russell's Mills. The writer of this paragraph did not comprehend what was involved in the performance of setting up an iron forge. He must have arranged with somebody to obtain the water right and for flowage. Then a dam must be built and buildings for the business. Machinery must be brought by land or sea and installed. Laborers would have to be hired, transported, and housed. Supplies would have to be brought. Capital would have to be obtained to pay the cost of labor and materials. And then there would be required a public consent to use the water power, because such utilities could not be used merely by private agreement. Then, when the factory was ready, iron must be brought by sea or land, and the manufactured product carried away to some market. For all this, there would be houses, a store, tavern, landing place, roads, and possibly a school and meeting house. Could these numerous activities have operated and then sink into oblivion and leave no trace behind? It would seem to be the conclusion of the whole matter to inform the reader that there cannot be found a vestige of any of these things in the locality, and not a hint in any public or private record. If these things or similar affairs ever existed, they have vanished like a cloud and left not a hint behind. No wonder that the lady Elisha Leonard once bluntly remarked, quote, that so far as Dartmouth was concerned, Ralph Russell was a myth. So, there you have a bit of what Henry Worth is all about. So now, I'm going to put that away and switch to Plan B. And this involves a project that I have been working on for a while and that is about to go public, and you are the first inaugural audience to hear about it, and I hope that we will get participation. My project is Old Place Names in Old Dartmouth. As I have done research over the years, from time to time I would read something and someone would mention a place name and I'd say, where the heck is that? I have no idea. And eventually I started a file in my computer and I would just put names like that into the file, and once in a while I'd find an answer. Oh, that was over there. Often I did not. And the file started getting bigger and bigger. And at some point I said, you know, I should get other people involved in this. And because I used to work over at the Lloyd Center, and my boss and friend Alan Hankin used to always like to say, none of us are as smart as all of us. And this seemed like a perfect kind of project to put that to use. So I have compiled a large list of old place names from within the 5 towns of Old Dartmouth. And as I say, some of them I've identified and some I have not. The entire list is now on the Whaling Museum's website, and I'm going to ask for help from other historians, i.e. you. So, let me get the right piece of paper here. I wanted to, for this group in particular, I wanted to pick some examples from right here. So, in Beverly Glennon's book on the history of Dartmouth, there is a map of Russell's Mills. And it is a map that was drawn in 1831 by Henry Howland Crapo. And early in his career, when he was being a surveyor before he moved to New Bedford. And on his map of Russell's Mills, right here where Alderbrook Farm is, there is a label that says Clayville. Clayville? Can anybody here enlighten me about Clayville? I've never heard of it before. I've never seen it printed anywhere else. As far as I can tell, there was no one named Clay who lived here, but I could be wrong. Or maybe there were clay deposits, but that doesn't really seem right either. I don't know. We'll see what we can find. Okay, let's pick another. Gamage's Mountain. Gamage's Mountain. Anyone here know?
It's over on Fish Road. Great Rock.
It's right, but behind the Grange Hall, the big rock up high, and at one time that was called Observatory Hill, and there was a platform built on it that you could climb up to. And you may have seen there are a couple of William Allen Wall paintings that show the head of the river, and they are undoubtedly done from that vantage point. But the Gamage family apparently owned that property at one time, and so it was called Gamage's Mountain. Okay, I picked out some others here. Cheapside in New Bedford. Anyone know Cheapside? Actually, Cheapside was on Pleasant Street between Union and William. Yeah, and named after a district in London that was known as Cheapside. Okay, Clayville, I said. Dogfish Bar. Dogfish Bar was in the Acushnet River. It was a sand bar, and it no longer exists. It must have been dredged out of existence, but there are several records in it. It was north of the Coggeshall Street Bridge, somewhere in the Acushnet River. And that's about all I can tell you about Dogfish Bar. Halifax. There was a neighborhood on County Street in New Bedford that was known as Halifax. Not sure why. There it was. Heath's Neck or Heathen's Neck. There must be someone here who knows that.
Yeah, that's down by Narragansett.
Correct.
The head of the thing, because that was opposite where Russell's Garrison was.
Correct.
It was also called Indian Town.
Howard's Neck. This is an important one. Who knows Howard's Neck?
That's over on the Acushnet River. That's one of the first settlements.
Right. In that other piece I read, that he says that the first settlement was on the east side of the Acushnet River. And that's at Howard's Neck, which is about...
It's right near the Acushnet-Fairhaven line.
Yeah, it's about a half-mile south of the bridge, the Wood Street Bridge, I would guess. And Paddy Hollow. Some of the names that have not survived were a bit derogatory. And Paddy Hollow was a neighborhood in New Bedford around Chancery and Arnold Street. And I found that in a Standard Times article from 1927. Perry's Neck.
Yes, that's Plainville.
Correct.
That's where the airport is now.
Correct. And I first ran across that in one of Daniel Ricketson's notebooks. He said, I heard of a fox being shot in the vicinity of Perry's Neck.
Henry Worth also had an unpublished essay about a stroll he took from Faunt's Corner down what we now know as Old Fall River Road onto Perry's Neck.
So normally when we think of neck, we think of something sticking out into the water like Sconnecut Neck.
This was surrounded by a swamp.
Right, it was...
Higher land and a swamp.
Right, exactly.
It's like a peninsula, basically.
Point Peril.
That's Sconnecut Neck.
Yes. Gooseberry Neck. There's early maps that call it Point Peril.
Potter's Hill on that list? Potter's Hill?
Potter's Hill? Did I have a Potter something? Yes. Oh yeah, that's the corner of Rockland and Dartmouth Street.
Who was Potter?
I'm not sure. There was a family of Potters that lived in that area.
And where rural cemeteries?
Yeah.
Turkey Hill.
Oh, that's over in Westport, isn't it?
No. That was in Fairhaven. There, Alden Road was at one time called Turkey Hill Road, but I don't know exactly where the hill in question was. Tuxedo Park. This was a term of derision in the late 19th century for a row of ramshackle houses on the south side of Maxfield Street, from Liberty west to Hunter.
That was like a swampy area at that time.
Right.
I grew up on Beach Street.
So, this list, and many more than what I've read here, is already on the Whaling Museum's website. At some point, there's going to be a convenient link for people who read that list if they want to add things or make comments or ask questions. That link isn't quite done yet. Sorry. But what I can do is give out my email address and the link for where this list is on the Whaling Museum's website, and anybody who wants to can contact me and say either I know the answer to one of your questions, or I've got one of my own that I've always wondered about, and I would like to see this expand and become a real community project. Again, none of us are as smart as all of us, and I hope that I will get some participation from this group. And thank you, and glad to be here.
I'm sure that Bob will answer a few questions, if there are any questions from the audience.
I think,
Richard?
to me, one of his greatest and most inscrutable achievements was how he drew the early maps of property owners of Dartmouth and Westport based solely on Crane's field notes and trying
Correct.
to put that and fitting that together.
Correct.
That's an almost impossible task to do that from scratch.
No.
Correct. The original property descriptions are so nebulous, and two different people have attempted that. Henry Worth did, and there are 3 of his maps reconstructed from Crane surveys that cover Dartmouth and Westport that are at the Whaling Museum Library. But Elisha Leonard tried to do the same thing, and his maps are at the New Bedford Library. I don't know how closely they match, and I recently got a hint that there is some additional Henry Worth unpublished material related to the town of Fairhaven that has never been seen, and that is going to be deposited in the Fairhaven Library eventually, and that there is at least one map included in that. So I...
Yeah, in recent years, by the way, just a few years ago, they did ground radar surveys, and like showing in Westport, it showed the location where the old stone walls are, they
Yeah.
matched that against worst map, it matches
Yeah,
exactly
yeah.
now.
He was very good, very good.
Well,
Yeah, have you read any of Franklin's, Howland's books?
Yes, a history of Acushnet, and
And
in
his
fact,
other one too, on the Howland. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
Acushnet is a good one. Is that?
right, and he has a whole section on old houses in
Right.
there, and he says in his introduction, I got this material from Henry Worth. And the photographs are from Fred Palmer.
Yeah.
So Howland used that material in
That was
his,
right about the same time.
Yeah.
The turn of the century.
right,
Because he also describes the Hathaway families, which were original settlers, again, on the east side of the Acushnet River, with the Cooks,
Right.
John Cook and so forth.
right.
And how much land they owned from, say, Oxford Village all the way out to Long Plain.
Right, and I've been doing a little bit of research on the Hathaway land ownership in New Bedford, where the, what do you call it, the greenhouse, Alan Haskell's property was part of the John Hathaway farm, which stretched all the way to where the solar farm on Hathaway Road is now. And that solar farm was where Mr. Sullivan had his
Ledge.
quarry.
Sullivan's Ledge.
Yeah,
They get all the granite to do the curbstones all over New Bedford.
and many buildings.
And there was a sawmill right at the low end at 140 there, and William Hathaway was part owner.
Right. And it turns out that there were two Hathaway families not closely related, and there were members of both who lived on Hathaway Road.
That's right, they're my ancestors.
And another source of much confusion.
Yeah.
So
Well,
I,
there's a nice book out there, that breaks it all down, the Hathaway families of America.
yes, I've spent time with that one.
Not perfect.
I don't want to open up another can of worms, but I will. You're talking
Please.
about named places. There are named ledges and rocks all over the bay here. I have no idea who was Hussey of Hussey's Rock, who was Clark of Clark's Cove. They go on and on and on. You know, a Great Ledge was a Great Ledge, or Lone Rock was a Lone Rock, but a lot of these have names. With Brooklyn Rock named after it, Decatur Rock, were these all shipwrecks?
Uh-huh.
And those names have been on charts since early 19th century, so if they were early shipwrecks.
Right. One of those, the Clark's Cove and Clark's Point, Henry Worth talks about that, but he doesn't answer the question. And I found one citation, there is a rock offshore, see if I can find this quickly. Old Bartleby.
Yeah, right off of Clark's Cove, right off the point.
And that's,
Old Barnes.
right, that's named after a similar feature off the coast of England. Not for anybody local. And I found that in a book called Sight Seeking, Clues to the Landscape History of New England, that talks about how some of the place names in New England were transplanted from Europe.
There's quite a bit of talk about the origin of the name Barney's Joy. Also.
Yes.
Very popular subject.
Supposedly Nantucket.
Could be.
I'm curious about Rockadundy.
Yes, lots of people are curious about
And I
Rockadundy.
have my own theory.
Okay,
Rockadundy was an area where some whalers in southern, Central America put in for water, and the place was called Rockadundy. And a family that were involved in the shipboard members were all from one family, and they came back and they named Rockadundy after this place in Central America. And the prior to that, on some maps of South Dartmouth, it says, instead of Rockadundy, it says, on the way to Chadler's place. Before it was called Rockadundy, it was, but anyway, that's the little part that I have kind of unearthed.
The former town planner, Don Perry, was purported to have made a long list of place names in Dartmouth. I don't know whether that list, I never saw the list, I only heard about it, or whether that list would have stayed in his office when he left, or whether that was something he took with him, worth pursuing perhaps.
Okay.
Again, I would like to encourage you to stick around and we can have informal questions. Enjoy the refreshments. We have a donation jar in the back. We have sign-up sheets if you'd like to join our organization. I assure you, we have many more very good programs coming. Again, I really thank you, Robert.
All right.
You lived up to my expectations.
And please, if you're interested in the old place names, I've got paper here with the links and how to access all of that.
Thank you.